Hello humans. Hello humans. This is das Woo Brot, or Woo Brot. It'd probably be sounding the same even in Dutch, but it's woo bread. I'm making bread. I am actually making bread now. I've just gotten done with one part of it, and that's the whole point of this, is that making bread involves fermentation. If you read into Boskovich's descriptions of fermentation, you get a real sense of how magical it is here in the materium for something to be able to alter matter. I mean seriously, we alter matter continuously ourselves. When we eat food, we ferment the stuff and it passes through the acids in our stomach, it's broken down. It's called the chyme at that point, and it breaks down, then it goes into your gut, it's fermented by bacteria, and then these little hairs that are in your intestine extract the nutrients. And then those nutrients get through a process, get further processed, ultimately getting dumped into the blood to get shoved around to, or lymph or other processes in the body to get them to where they're needed. And so we ferment our bodies in the process of growing them, and with assistance, the bacteria. And even virus, we have a virome, just like we have a gut biome. Anyway, so fermentation is extremely powerful. In many ways, probably the most powerful process on this planet, generated by organic life. Okay, so a volcano is very powerful, but it's not fermentation, right? And there's no organic being that we're aware of that's spewing out all of the lava and so forth. So entirely different kind of, geophysical processes aside, of the natural processes that we discover in reality, in this materium, that deal with energy. Fermentation is extremely powerful, albeit slow. It's not an explosive. It can be explosive at its final process. It's not normally so. You can do things to enhance its explosive nature, like we do with champagne, and you ferment it, and if you do it right, they didn't have to add carbon dioxide. They did it with this repeated process of upending the bottle and getting the dregs out, all of this kind of stuff, introducing oxygen in small quantities in the process of the fermentation over time, repeatedly packing in more and more carbon dioxide in that fresh fermentation action that occurs when that oxygen is introduced. Same thing with port. With port, they do it a different way, though, because port is a kind of fortified wine. As they age that, they go through a process, and as small amounts of oxygen are introduced into it, it doesn't become carbonated, but it does have an effervescence that simply fortifying wine will not produce. Anyway, so this is das Woo Brot, and we're going to, this is Halloween. It's the last day of Red October, 31/10/2021, and we're about to get into November, which is one of the serious months here. We're going to have November, December, and January as very serious months. This discussion about fermentation brings up the issue of time. Okay, so I'm making bread. I'm actually making a Julia Child's white sandwich loaf, right? I was vegetarian for 35 years, was a very good baker. I could win prizes for baking. I was that good. I know flours down to the hydration level, and the fat content and the protein, and how all these go together, and whether you can use this, that, or the other thing with them and get good results, and so on. And so I did it just to survive, and I was also supplementing. So I was a baker at a scientific level, and as I say, I was pretty good at it. Along comes the cancer. Had forced me into being a vegetarian for a lot of different reasons I won't go into. The type of long, slow-growing, undiagnosed colon cancer that I had didn't like it when I ate meat and built up my tissues. And so it affected me for 30 plus years, 35 years actually. Let me think now, 37. Okay, so I had the cancer, and I come up to the last few years there, the last 3 years, and my digestion has gone to hell, and I can't eat grains anymore. And I do a blood test, and they discover I've got these genetic markers for gluten intolerance. Okay, it's kind of odd. I've been eating gluten for years and never really had any issues with it, but okay, you know, it was, but in any event, so a slight diversion, it turns out that in my way of thinking, my conclusion is, and I've had more conclusions to this way, the DNA does not describe our physical body, nor the inheritance. It does have associations from inheritance, but what it describes, or what DNA is, are epigenetic recording system. So it's kind of like a system of systems. It's kind of like the registry in Windows, where you have all of these little lines that can do things for you under certain circumstances. So these are where all of your epigenetic triggers are. And so I had 2 of these gene codings that scientists have associated with celiac disease and gluten intolerance in a general sense. I don't think I have those, all right? I think that was the cancer screwing with my system that made those things appear. Because what I did was I went through the debulking, started getting into the getting well process after having died from the colon cancer and the surgery, and then they did stuff and threw me back, and my body was there, but I had to rebuild it, right? This was terrible. I didn't want to come back. My body was just so wasted. It was 128 pounds. I'd been through the last 7-8 years, increasing amounts of pain and mental distortion from the pain and so on. And was just tired of it, right? I was just tired of having gone through all of that. And so, so that was like 7/13, 2018, and then all through the rest of 2018 up until 2019 March, I decided, okay, so I was basically sort of seeing if I was going to survive, right? Because they were still finding cancer cells, and there was all this shit going on for this period of time, from July to March of the following year. And then finally in March I said, okay, I'm tired of fucking around with these people. I'd actually fired my oncologist in end of January, I think. And it just wasn't getting anywhere with these guys. And I realized it was the system, right? Anyway, so, but as of March, I got serious about it. I spent a couple of months reading books about cancer and various forms of treatment. I know most of us bogus. I found some good information, went way deep, went all the way back to the Yellow Emperor in China, and, you know, a couple of 1,000-year-old manuals on how to deal with shit. Came to some conclusions, and one of the conclusions was that I had to rebuild my body and basically go all the way back, right? So I threw carbs out and got rid of them, and started building back up on a deliberate eating pattern, so to speak, right? A goal, set goals for myself, building muscle mass, because I was 128 pounds, you know, stripped down, thrown on a weigh bed, on a scale bed, at the point of death. And my usual weight is around 100, my fighting weight, as I say, was around 170 pounds. And I'm back there now. But it took me all the way from March of 2019, all through rest of 2019, all of 2020, and all of 2021 to get here now. And so, so over these 2 years, so 2020, 2021, and this, we're almost in November here. And at the end of like yesterday, I started reintroducing flour to my diet. Haven't had any flour, haven't had any grains for a couple of years. So I did this. I made myself some bread, because I'm not going to buy anything commercial, because you're not getting bread. So go look at the ingredients. Bread should have flour, water, yeast, and salt. And then you can add stuff to make it into some other kind of bread, but basically, all breads, like the French say, should have that in them. And they go bad, you throw them away. You don't have preservatives, you don't put in all this other stuff that the human would have to eat. And I'm very paranoid about all that stuff now. So I make myself bread, and I go through the process of the fermentation process all the way through. It's okay, I eat it, it's great, it tastes good. And now I can introduce it back into my body, or into my dietary routine as we go forward here into the Woo, right? This is because I'm doing this deliberately at this time. Now, I was really pissed, right? Because here I was trying to rebuild my body and get in all of this stuff, and all of a sudden, boom, COVID, the global war with the elite, the pandemic, the whole thing, the injectable euthanasia shots, all of this shit pops up all at the time that I should be dead or retired. Here I am having to rebuild my body up to some fighting weight and get pissed again so that I can join the fight, right? Anyway, so it kind of irritated me. It got to me yesterday. This was, my video yesterday was before I had my bread, which mellowed me out a bit. But it's just been really rough. We've gotten I get several hundred emails minimum a day. And got a lot of a particular kind, and I've got individuals in my own circle of people that are passing, that are victims of this. So it's rough to take, right? And we are in a war, and we've got to understand that the nature of war is like making Woo bread, or any bread. It's like the fermentation process. And this is what's going on here at the moment, is that we're all in the fermentation. And so when you get your ferment going, whether you're making beer or bread or wine or fermenting stock for, distilled liquors or, like vodka, that sort of thing, all of these, you get your starter going first, and then basically you wait. Okay, you introduce the yeast to the warm water and give them something to eat, usually something sweet in the form of a sucrose. And they eat this stuff, and they start becoming bubbly and active and so on. And if they don't, you got to pitch them out. But you can't just put the yeast in there with the sugar and then see nothing and throw it away. You have to wait, right? So all of these decisions, is the yeast good, is the yeast bad, that kind of thing. All of this stuff has to be done with time involved. And this is a problem, a real conundrum for people that have not been raised, have not had this idea inculcated into them. That is to say, every generation that is digital and wore digital watches, non-mechanical watches, every generation that has had the digital experience leading up into the generations now, are all trained into a level of immediacy that amplifies the dopamine response and this kind of thing, because of the devices and the software are all engineered to do that, but also the very nature of accelerating the gratification in time, closer in time. So there is a qualitative and quantitative difference of experience between waking up and wanting a piece of toast and waking up and going and getting it, putting into getting a piece of bread out of a sack and throwing it into a toaster and pushing the little thing down and sitting back, right? Everybody knows the toaster is going to take some time to do its thing and pop up. Time is involved throughout all of the processes that we as humans interact with and express. We are time machines in a very real sense. Other animals are not. So animals have don't really have strong memories, and they're not time machines. Dogs and some of those animals that we interact with are exceptions to some degree, but they're not the way we are. But anyway, so there's a qualitative difference between getting toast by putting it into the toasting machine from your sack and having it pop up a few minutes later, and having to make the bread first, right? And then go through the whole process, cook the bread and so on, in order that you might have the toast the next day. or later on that day. But usually people, when you make bread, you hack off half of it or so and of the first loaf and consume it with whatever meal, and then the rest is eaten the next day. All right, so the Woo in the war against the global elites requires time, just like the fermentation. Egyptian people that were in charge of, that were like supervisors, that were in charge of building crews and this sort of thing. The Egyptians didn't build the pyramids, the pharaohic Egyptians, that's what I'm talking about, the ancient Egyptians. They didn't build the pyramids, but they did build a lot of stuff. And they were really good at carvings and all of this kind of stuff, right? All of which take time. It takes a long time to chisel effectively on particular kinds of stone and so on. And there are rhythms to all of this, and within that there is a time allotment for action of life on the part of all the supervisors. So the supervisor of a building crew in pharaohic Egypt would know that he's got to get certain people up at literally the minute that the sun rises up over the horizon, and get these people working on that day's bread in order that that day's bread might be ready for all of the workers that he's then got to get up in a couple of hours to get out and do the job, right? And by bread at that point in ancient Egypt, these poor bastards that were doing the work were fed a diet of basically a barley gruel. And from that barley gruel, from that origination point of the Egyptian barley gruel, we get beer and bread, because there it was both. It was a live ferment process gruel that they would eat during in the morning. It was a sour ferment that they started going, basically a sourdough starter with crudely crushed grains and very coarse, not really flour at all, harsh on the gut. And they had that for their morning meal, and then later in the day they would have that same stuff after it had been had other stuff processed into it and had been allowed to ferment throughout the whole day, and then it was cooked after a crude fashion, right? And so, as you may imagine, Egyptian workers lived a very short, miserable life. And there was a lot of attention devoted to places for evacuation, but they didn't do a good job of it, okay? So if you go and look at the remnants of cemeteries and these large ancient cesspits that were there for pharaohic Egypt, you can see their diet. You can see the problems. I mean, they actually, if you look at the cemeteries, you find that most of them died, most of the workers in the cemeteries died before age 28. They've been working since maybe age 8, if they were lucky to get out of work that long. Most of them had all of their teeth broken or worn down by the grit in their food, and had associated problems within their musculature and their systems and their bodies because of poor diet and poor availability of nutrients within their diet. So no way could you have, if you examine all of the pre-modern grave sites in ancient Egypt and go through and look at all of these bodies, you will determine, just seeing that none of these people, none of that society it was not possible for these people to have built the pyramids. They simply were not robust enough to have performed this level of work. Most of the bodies there showed multiple fractures from all forms of bone wasting disease because of calcium deprivation and vitamin B and D deprivation, right? And so they were in miserable shape, and they had very short, miserable lives. The other upper class, on the other hand, they were the long-lived ones, and they had reasonably long lives up until the point that they encountered some form of sepsis injury from other form of poison or some catastrophic accident. So it was rare, for instance, to see pharaohic mummies with any damage to any of the long bones. They would have all kinds of damage to knuckle joints and would have shown arthritis and these sorts of things, but they were not usually out there in anything at risk of breaking their bones, which was good because they were as brittle, almost as brittle as the people that supported them, that worked for them and produced the pharaohic society that we think of when we think of ancient Egypt. Anyway, though, the part of the process that the supervisor in ancient Egypt would do would be to initiate the morning ferment. And it was a big religious ritual thing with them, right? They recognized the magic of the transformation of this terrible, terrible stuff into something that was at least semi-digestible, if not palatable, by the addition of these bacteria, a mother that you would take and put in from yesterday's stuff into today's batch, that you're always carrying it forward. So this is a concept of the time necessary in fermentation and making your bread, right? Das Woo Brot. And so that's what I'm doing now. Is I'm not killing time. I'm investing time. I'm using time. I'm aware of the time. I've got to get in for my bread. It'll be done pretty soon. I can put it in the oven. I'm on that process of it. And so you let the yeast do its stuff with its sugar, honey, something to give it some energy, and you find out it's good. You don't have to throw it away. Then you start adding in the flour, and you don't add the salt until you've had about half the flour, and you work it and so on. And then that's when you form your relationship with the yeast in attacking the flour. So it's a destructive process as the yeast breaks down the flour. We can't digest flour. You can digest flour if you cook it, right? If you sit there and you have to cook white flour for nearly 20 minutes on its own to be able to simply digest the stuff and be able to have it bioavailable nutrients out of it. And it doesn't have that much anyway. But and it doesn't taste good to just simply have cooked flour. You have to cook it very slow and so on. That's why we have gruels, right? All right, so also they didn't have the ability in ancient Egypt, they didn't have the luxury of having fuel to do a lot of cooking that way. So they used fermentation as cooking. And you can cook also with acids. So you could do the same process for flour as you do for ceviche. If you wanted to add enough acids to the flour, you could get it to break down enough that you could digest it. But man, I would never put that stuff in my mouth. I mean, the acids would be like lemon juice and stuff, but still, well, although, you know, lemon cookies, okay, that kind of thing. But anyway, in any event though, so they'd throw in the stuff in the ferment. They'd do all the praying over it, big vats. Everybody stirs and beats the crap out of it. That's the same way as me with my bread, in the process of stirring in the flour to develop what is known as gluten there. This is different from the commercial gluten that they extract from flour with a commercial process and inject into everything else. That is so terrible on you, because that's just concentrated lectins. In this process, the fermentation, it actually breaks down the lectins and makes these grains digestible for me if I do this correctly. And so if I don't do it correctly, I'll get something that's indigestible. So I don't cook it thoroughly, you know, all different kinds of things. Don't let it raise enough. You end up, it can be bad because you don't allow time to process it. So we have this intimate relationship through fermentation to time, and we have this time relationship anyway. It's just that a lot of the people that are digitally addicted don't recognize it, because that speeds you up and changes your mind. And so the woo is slow. Fermentation is slow, but it's going to be the biggest bomb that's ever gone off on this planet, is the fermentation bomb right now that's going on in the war against the globalist elite. Because we're moving slow. They expected fast response. They expected, you know, I don't know what they expected really, but everybody's just going slow, taking their time, beating them down. We got no real hurry, you know, got to stop and make our bread and get our energy for the fight, this kind of thing. So anyway, my bread gets the flour added, and then gets half the flour added. The gluten develops the long strands that bind it all together. And so this takes a while. This takes a process. This takes energy. This takes my involvement, commitment, and so on. Then I put in the salt, and that puts it in with other flour in order that the salt doesn't kill all the yeast. The salt does do that. It stops the fermentation process and kills the yeast. So I don't eat the yeast. I eat the product of the yeast doing their work, but not the bacteria itself, which is killed through the salt and through the cooking process. And contributes to the level of protein and the other nutrients. And various different kinds of bacteria or yeast can bring in various different sorts of things. This is why we have sourdough and bring in the flavors. And you have various different kinds of sourdough, various different kinds of champagne yeast, wine yeast, beer yeast, and so on. They all contribute something to there because it is life contributing its time, its energy, its processes to that fermentation, that there may be transformation, that there may be magic there. And believe me, when you see me sit up there in the morning and beat some ingredients together and stuff, and it's a little chunk of white stuff here and a little bit of pink salt and this kind of thing, and I throw it all together, and then a few hours later we eat that, and that touches your tongue, you understand the magic of the fermentation process, and it is truly magical. And that's what's going on right now, right? So our sock, in relation to the war, knew that it had to ferment, right? We had a ferment process going. Ferment process may have been going from 2008 or 9. Satoshi Nakamoto may have been involved in this ferment. So it might have been a good temporal marker for the ferment process that's going to involve all of humanity. It's a creative destruction process that's going to upend all of our understanding of everything and involve us into this giant mass of das Woo Brot. And we're going to become woo bread because we have to in order to survive. This is a humanity survival thing, right? If I'm going to go to war, I'm going to make a very specific kind of bread. I'm going to pack that bread with all kinds of nutrients. I'm going to put time and energy into it. I'm going to let it ferment to just be as powerful a bread as I possibly can, such that when I take that bread and I eat it, and my own personal fermentation process of my gut and everything extracts all of those nutrients, I become as powerful as I possibly can. And an element of this is that it must take time. At all levels. And so we're involved in the time process now, and it's driving everybody crazy. The nature of this war is unlike any other. Our war with the power elite will be won by humanity, is being won now, and it is a slow process that if it were a loaf, if you were doing a loaf, and this was your first part of it, you'd have everything in there, you mix all your ingredients together, and then you let it rest. You walk away and you don't abuse the yeast in its interaction with the water, the flour, the salt, and the sugar, okay? And then you come back and you see where before you had left this little sort of like dough, not really very much of anything, just sitting in the bottom of the bowl. You come back, it's all raised up and there's little bubbles all around it. And it's actively participating in aiding you in making your bread. And that's where we're right now with this war. And we're seeing the results of that. We're seeing the bubbles start popping up in humanity as the gases and everything start fermenting and providing pressure underneath. And it just is going to keep going and keep going and keep going and keep going because we've done everything just perfectly. We've got the right amount of salt, we're going to let it rise to the certain amount of time, then we're going to knead it, then we're going to punch it down and just beat the shit out of it. And then we form it, then we mix in a lot more ingredients, a little bit more flour, right, just working on it. Maybe we're going to put in some softened butter to get some oils in there, just mush it all around. And then we're going to put it into the loaf pans after it's shaped, formed, and then we're going to go through this whole process again of letting it rise until we see the top of the crust, and then we're going to come along and gently cut that with razor blades and put it into a 375-degree oven for between 30 and 45 minutes. Again, to be determined. All right, so in war, your plans have to change with every one of your enemy's responses. And in war, you have to wait for your enemy to respond in order to beat the shit out of them. So there's waiting involved all around, right? And it's unpredictable as to how long this will take, because we don't know how long it's going to take the bastards to respond, find out that that didn't work for them, come up with another response, find out that didn't work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So this this process is not, it is to be determined, all right? So we're making das Woo Brot. We're going to make a really nice, fine, thick, meaty loaf, right? We're going to put in all kinds of stuff in there that will take us through into the future, that will give us huge tons of nutrients. But before we bake it, just as we're in the process of making it into loaves, we're going to chop off a chunk. We're going to take that little chunk and we're going to put it into an airtight container, glass container, put it in a refrigerator. That's our mother. Okay, that's an encapsulation of that experience of making bread that can age on its own and is not consumed now. That is the woo that we're going to carry forward into the future, so that future generations don't have to go through this shit. Anyway, guys, go make your woo bread.